Hi, this is Dana Hahn-Klein here with Barry Jenkins for Moonlight. Very rarely do we get to see sort of people of color in a film like this, and then also sort of dealing with the spectrum of not just like a typical romantic relationship. Like you basically went, let me go for like race and LGBTQ, you know, rainbow of.
It's intersectional, yeah.
Yes. What kind of made you take that challenge on?
You know, it was in the source material. Terrell McCraney wrote this play in Moonlight Black Boys Look Blue, and Terrell and I grew up in this neighborhood in Miami, and both our moms went through this sort of struggle with addiction to crack cocaine. And so it was just embedded in the DNA of both the source material, but also in our lives growing up in Miami.
Speaking of your moms, the female characters in this film are a very interesting thing for me, at least, because they sort of represent, like, yes, there's the family you're born into, and then there's the family you choose, and the family you choose can be...
Well, and also the family that chooses you.
And the family that chooses you. And so I thought one of the interesting things was you had the same actresses play the characters throughout the course of the film versus like the
men all change.
Yes, yeah. So I'm curious, like, did you ever think about sort of paralleling the changes with the...
No, part of it was intellectual, just from a craft standpoint. I felt like, because we were doing this conceit of the main character being played by different actors, and then on the other side, you know, his love interest being played by different characters, I felt like the audience needed something that was concrete, that they could root themselves in, and to me, that character was this mob character. For sure. And then once we cast Janelle Monáe, I just realized, I think there's something, these women aren't in opposition to each other. I think they complement one another. And it felt right to do the same thing and have the women be like this constant presence. Because, you know, both Terrell and I would say, you know, I'll speak for myself, I never really had a father figure growing up, but there was a group of women who were consistently there, you know, throughout my life. And I think the movie's a reflection in a certain way of the way I grew up, and it just felt, not even intellectual. It just felt like, oh yeah, the women are going to be the same. The men will all change, but the women will be the same.
Speaking of going back to what you said earlier about the family that chooses you, I just want to dive into this one scene that I think for me was the most surprising thing, and it was shocking in terms of it's the scene where they're at the dinner kitchen table, and he goes, you know, what's a faggot? And the reaction from the two characters was just so unexpected for me, right? Because it felt like it was a time that's very homophobic, you know, in a culture that's very homophobic, and they just sort of were like supportive. So I'd love to talk about just sort of like filming that scene, like dealing with a young actor who probably doesn't necessarily live in those times.
Well, you know, the whole film is rooted in Terrell's friendship with this character that Mahershala Ali's character Juan is based on, you know, and so whatever is in that relationship, in that scene, you know, again, it's rooted, most of the things in this film were rooted in something that actually happened to Terrell or happened to me. And so it was one of those things where, you know, people keep talking about the movie and the idea of stereotypes, and I feel like stereotypes come from the outside. You know, for us, the character Juan is not a type at all. You know, he's an actual person that Terrell knew. And when we got there to shoot that scene, it was day 3 of production. And, you know, Alex has never acted before, Janelle has never acted before. And it didn't dawn on me that we were doing anything that was special or different or particular in any way. I try to approach every scene the same way. The character's putting a pot on the stove, treat it the same way as 2 kids making out on the beach, you know? We're going to shoot it the same way. We're going to approach it the same way. But that day was different, and I'll say the issue was not with Alex. I mean, he, you know, I'll give that kid credit. I'll give his mom the most credit. In the casting process, we told the parents, you know, if they wanted to, they could only read the first part of the script, you know. You know, when we auditioned with scenes that weren't in the film, and then we brought the parents out, we gave them the full script, and then they went home with their kids, and they read the entire screenplay to them. So Alex knew what the film was about. He knew what the themes were, and he took them very seriously, and he showed up to set, and he was just ready. The issue with that day was more for me, and just, you know, it's day 3 of production. I haven't directed a film in 8 years, about trying to find a way to very organically allow the space to have a conversation that you're right, people are going to be surprised by, but it's just as organic as a character putting a pot on a stove.
I think another beautiful thing was they say, like, don't work with animals and children, and you have a film that's so dependent on these, like, understated performances from children, and, like, kudos to you and your casting director, because, and the actors, of course, because it's just, like, I don't want to say, like, teen and juvenile angst, but, like, some of those emotions were just really fulfilling, and like
Yeah.
I was like, that's dead on. And even though I come from the other coast and I'm a you know, an Asian woman, I'm still like, nope, I got it, I got you what you're going for. Like,
Nice.
but in terms of sort of dealing with the cast and
I forbid them from meeting both the blacks and the Kevins, and the three blacks, you know, in particular. I didn't want them to mimic one another. You know, to me the idea was that the characters are being shaped by the world, by the environment so much, and in between the chapters, so much time passes that by the time we get to the next stage, they become a different person. And so I wanted to rely on the casting and the way we were filming them to sort of like create this continuity. And the idea, you know, the poster's right there in front of me. You know, these guys all have the same thing in their eyes, you know? And I felt like if we could just cast three actors who had, you know, the same feeling, the same vulnerability in their eyes, that the audience would go on this journey with them, despite the fact that they look different in each chapter.
one of the things I love from the narrative perspective is the chapters and the story. And would you say there are like defining moments in your life, either good or bad, that are like the chapters for you that led you to this?
Yeah, that was the idea. Well, you know, in the source material, it wasn't set up in chapters. It was non-linear, jumping back and forth in time. But I'll give credit to Terrell. Terrell built these sort of like these defining moments, you know, in the piece that I felt like were strong enough to build this housing around. That we had three very distinct sort of like chapters or sections of story in this person's life. And so instead of having a coming of age story where we're dealing with decades and decades of time and story, you know, we're going to take each moment and be like, okay, this is a very foundational moment. This is a foundational moment. Now this is a foundational moment.
In terms of Terrell's involvement in it, you know, I feel like it's a very personal story for him in several ways. Sort of as you went through the shoot, and as you know, every shoot and story evolves as you start to make it, and having Terrell available, like as a resource, like what was that sort of?
No, Terrell was really great about, like, as an artist who, you know, creates, you know, stories in a whole different medium. He was really awesome about, you know, this is your thing. You know, you go off and do it. You know, he gave me his blessing. In the early stages, you know, I was working with him. I wanted him to adapt the piece himself, you know, with very, like, you know, very concrete notes from me about structure and things like that. And so we talked about it over a series of months, and then he became a MacArthur genius and didn't have time to do the writing.
Those geniuses.
I know. But at that point, we had communicated so well, you know, what I felt the piece was and what I was going to do to translate to the screen, that he felt comfortable, you know, allowing me the space to go off and do it. And then when we were filming, you know, I think because, and I realize this now, the more I see him watch the film, it's extremely personal, some of the stuff in this film for him. And so I don't think, 'cause we kept inviting him to set, I don't think him being on set would have been a good thing, because he just had such a close proximity to some of the things that we were doing that I don't think it would have been the most comfortable environment, you know. But we were so on the same page in pre-production, you know, that by the time we were off and running, it was just, we were off and running.
Yeah, it's nice to see like a trust between.
Yeah.
I guess my final question for you is, if you go back to the beginning of shooting and give yourself one piece of advice, what would it be?
You know, I think to play more, you know. There was, I didn't feel pressure in a certain way, but, you know, as a person who's straight, you know, I really felt this responsibility to preserve Terrell's voice in the piece. And so there were certain elements of staging and things like that where I was like, no, it has to be this way, you know, because we have to preserve Terrell's voice. And I realize now there was probably more freedom I could have allowed myself. But at the same time, I couldn't have told this story without Terrell's source material and without his first-person perspective. So, you know, whatever variable that might have opened maybe would have taken us away from the place that we ended up. So I don't think I would do many things differently, man. It was a really amazing process making this film.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. It's a beautiful movie, and congratulations.
Thank you. Much appreciated.